Imagine waiting 2 weeks to know if you got a like or not, or a thumbs up. In the decades before the internet, people made comics, and we reached out to each other. What was it like? This is the Sequential Artists Workshop, and these are the 90s mini comics oral history archives. Come join us as we take a longer look at those analog days when communication was a lot slower, maybe more deliberate, maybe more reckless. Who knows? It was just different. Join us as we take a look and really notice how much things have changed. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome.
Hi, everyone. This is our next episode in our 90s mini comics oral history archives project. Today we'll be interviewing with Vjeran Pavlaković.
Yeah,
Did I butcher it?
Pretty close. Vjeran.
All right. All right.
Yeah, it was good. The J sounds like a Y sound, so Vjeran. But yeah, that was good.
All right. We'll go ahead and get into it. We'll start with our introduction, and this is a more proper way to introduce yourself. Can you please say your name, the date, and where you are recording from?
Hi, I'm Vjeran Pavlaković. I was publishing quite a bit as Vern or Verno the Inferno back in the day for the zines. Today is the 6th of September, 2024. I'm currently in Zagreb, Croatia, in my apartment in the kitchen, surrounded by piles of my old zines I've dug up to remind myself of those early days.
All right. And what are some of those comics publications that you created or were a part of in the pre-internet era?
So my main zine, where I published most of my comics, was called the Spleen Zine, but I worked with several other zinesters in Tucson, Arizona, back then in the early 90s, mid 90s. And then some of them were also made in Seattle because I had lived there when I was in grad school. But I guess the most famous, we can call it famous, comic was The Sheriff, which grew out of stories and anecdotes and inside jokes about a lot of my friends at the time. So it was really directed at them, but then became kind of its own comic, in fact.
Awesome. All right. So you've mentioned Seattle and Tucson. Were those the main locations that you worked from in the 80s and 90s, and were there any others?
Yeah, so started, I think, in the first one was in 94, I believe. Yeah, October 94 was the first issue in Tucson, Arizona, and then I moved to Seattle in early 97. So there were several issues published there, and the last one was actually completed in Zagreb, Croatia, when I was here on a Fulbright. But that one actually was never published. That was number 17, was never actually published until 2019 when there was a group in Zagreb, Croatia, doing zines and doing these workshops, and they published part of that in the scope of one of their fanzines. So it had a second life in a way. So it was a nice kind of completing the circle and having it finally in print, this last number 17 issue.
Yeah. Great. And how would you describe your comics work?
Well, I was also looking up in some other reviews of the comics. So I guess I would psychedelic, bizarre, surrealist. Actually, going back and reading over some of the comics years later, I was like, what was I thinking? How did this any make sense? A lot of non sequiturs. As I said, there was a lot of inside jokes, especially in the early issues. But as I got, I guess, better technically, and I started taking actually some art classes in Tucson, Arizona. And one summer I took a class actually on comic drawings with Joe Forcan. They got quite better, and actually I think my narrative style also got a lot better. But one of the reviews from Fact Sheet 5, actually, I know one of the later questions will be referring to that, but just to read this out, this was the second issue was reviewed. Comics and other assorted weirdness, much of it having to do with drugs. Some might say these comics can be enjoyed if you're stoned. I don't know. They're very messy. I'll have to ask someone who's stoned. So I don't know if that was really a great review or not, but really the whole point and the whole endeavor was getting friends together who I knew were drawing or doing art or writing, and I felt we'd be hanging out. And there wasn't that much to do in Tucson in like the early 90s necessarily, especially if you were underage. You couldn't really even go out to bars. So I thought, why are we wasting our creative energies as sitting around? Why don't we do something with it? So I'd always have these jam sessions and collect comics initially, but then poems and reviews and random thoughts. And that kind of actually created Spleenezine. And actually my roommate at the time, Chris Smith, he fantasized or wanted to do like a newsletter. That was his idea. And so combining sort of like a newsletter and comics, basically that was the first couple of zines, and then just kind of grew from that.
Awesome. All right, well, that'll bring us into our comics production section. Can you tell us how you made your comics, what tools you used, etc.?
So the comics, as even this review said, were quite messy. And the earliest phases was actually, instead of listening to my geometry teachers and science teachers, I'm a historian now, so obviously I didn't really do well in the sciences, was drawing comics in class. So in high school, I think even in junior high school, I was drawing the comics, often making fun of friends sitting across the aisle and in the other at the other desks. And one of the earlier ones was Spaceman Spiff, and this was about a friend of mine, and he'd always wanted to be a pilot. That was his dream. And so in the comics, he was flying these spaceships, again, very crudely drawn with a pencil and then inked and sometimes not even erased. So it was very, very messy. And actually, fun fact, he actually became a pilot and still works as a pilot to this day. So maybe these comics in sophomore year chemistry class actually kind of inspired him to become this pilot. Later on, I got a little better with technique. And as I said, first I took an art history 101 class one summer at the University of Arizona and learned about perspective and using other tools. So that really helped a lot. And then secondly was this comics class, also a summer class at Pima Community College. And there we started actually using real techniques and learning about using ink and like nibs and vellum, and then kind of drawing on pencil, then tracing over with the vellum and getting some nice lines and adding color to it. So that was really the evolution of that to kind of improve my style. And then I began doing more, I guess, one-shot kind of comics and playing around with the different styles. Some of them were actually homework for the class. And I guess I also got a little bit lazier, drawing the same character over and over. But that was the Sheriff. The Sheriff remained, like, as I said, the core comic of the whole Spleenezine run. And I even collected some of all of the sheriffs in like a special issue of just the Sheriff in there. And it's fascinating when you have these comics that are basically about your friends and a lot of, as I said, inside jokes and anecdotes, and people started living their characters. And even to this day, when I go back to Tucson, people refer to their comic book names, whether it's the Sheriff, and there's the Sheriff of Oro Valley and the Hexmaster and all these different characters that I'd made up. And people would be like eagerly waiting for the next issue to come out to see what their character had done in that comic. But as I said, it was also quite crude. And another technique I'd kind of developed in the earlier issues was using collage. And this had kind of started from my writing of letters as a pen pal to friends that had moved away. And then I would add these cutouts from various magazines and I would add them to the letter. It had this really kind of crude aesthetic, but I got better and better at actually incorporating the collage. So the spleen zine actually has a lot of collage elements in there, starting, as I said, quite rough and very chaotic, and then later on, as my drawing style got better, incorporating collage in the comics themselves. That was also a lot of fun. And actually, some of the last comics were almost all collage with then sound or like word bubbles added to them. I guess I should also, one of the earlier questions was asking about, you know, where I'd done the production, and I forgot to mention, actually in Croatia, there's actually a still running comic series, Komikaze. So like kamikaze, like the killing, but in Croatian with the Komikaze with the K. And it's this great artist and editor and comic drawer, Ivana Armanini, and she still does these comics. And it was, it started off with this like jam sessions with her, and then submitting a few comics to her early anthologies, I guess. I mean, they look kind of like zines, but had better production, and she's still doing some amazing work to this day. But I guess, yeah, that's sort of like the trajectory of the comics. And then later on, I moved on to painting and collaging with paint. So less of the comic production.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. And how would you ready your comics for print?
Well, early on, it was very, very crude. Lots of gluing and pasting and cutting. And then sort of, in addition to taking some of these art classes, probably the biggest transformation of the spleen zine was when I got hired to work at Kinko's print shop and copy shop. So suddenly I was part of the productive mechanism. I was actually in the place where the comics were made. And I used, and Kinko's was great because it was open 24 hours. We could go in there, you know, and you'd use all the straight lines and cutting and pasting and taping. And now I was working there and I had access to all of the tools. So a lot of the actual production would be done there, you know, all the layup. But it was, I would say it was very old school. Lots of paste and glue on your fingertips, looking around for the various letters that you'd cut out, just like setting up kind of like a ransom note or something like that. These very, yeah, kind of crude elements. But I kind of, initially it was accidental, and later it kind of became the aesthetic of the zine. Mm-hmm. Even though later on I had contributors, and I guess that was maybe even the best part about Spleen Zine, was bringing in the big group of collaborators. Later on, people were actually real artists contributing to this really kind of grimy Spleen Zine. So I always kept the old school methods, never under this like digital layouts or anything. It was always hand produced, I would say, even to the very last issue, number 17.
Awesome. All right. Do you remember how many you printed of your first comic and maybe how that changed over time?
I think the first couple were probably about runs of 50 to 100. I'm trying to remember. I mean, we were very poor college students at that time. Of course, when you get involved in this, you think of like, oh, I'm going to do a comic book and it's going to get sold and we're going to get money. You know, this very absurd ideas of what producing a zine was like. Of course, we never made any money on this. And as I said, the first issue was $1. Later on, we moved up to charging $2. But yeah, the initial runs were 50 to maybe 100. And then, as I said, I got hired at Kinko's. And well, Kinko's produced, at least at that time, lots of paper waste. So there would be boxes and boxes of paper thrown out every night or recycled every night. So there we could kind of get away with a little bit of subversive action and published a bit more. We even had a color issue at a time when printing in color was very expensive. So I think maybe at the peak we were talking maybe about 200 copies of each issue, perhaps. I mean, it was never like huge runs, but yeah, at that point we could actually afford, thanks to Kinko's, producing more issues at the time.
Awesome. All right. Well, that'll bring us into our noticing and awareness section. Can you tell us when you first saw evidence of people making their own comics?
I was thinking back to that. I mean, I'd grown up with very traditional comics and then started reading like the weirder ones of both Marvel and DC, and then you have like Dark Horse, and then was introduced to like Robert Crumb and some of those underground comics. But in terms of actually seeing someone do their own ones, I mean, it might actually even be Twilight Zine by Andrew Coltrane, who was, we both worked at this movie theater, Sayufi Theater, Century Park 12, I believe it was called. He was working in the as the cleanup or the trash duty. So they had that; those guys had the duty of going and cleaning up the theaters afterwards and dumpster diving. They were kind of like, I guess, hipster at that time. I was in concession and had to like bag popcorn and serve drinks. And I knew that he was doing these zines, this Twilight zine, and he had Captain 8 Ball and Booger Bear and these like weird characters. And actually, I had was fascinated and actually impressed by him. And in fact, they were like his other friend Luke, who was writing a lot for the zine. And I'd actually asked, could I write in his zine? And they told me, no, screw off, go make your own zine. And that's kind of like the birth of Spleen Zine. And another one of the managers there, who also is a very amazing artist, Irvin Stafford, he had randomly asked, okay, so what's the name of your zine? And I blurted out Spleen Zine because it rhymed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of like the birth of the name. So encountering homemade comics and I guess zines led to the creation of Spleen Zine quite soon after that. I mean, it must have been maybe a few months after I was rejected by Twilight Zine that the first issue came out. And of course, later on, we became great. I mean, we were still friends there. It was just sort of like, we're doing our own thing, you go do yours. And we even had lots of collaboration, and we even did like a split zine one year. It was called Twilight Zine 8.5. I think it was number 8 for my issue. We had an insert of another legendary Tucson zine called Cowboy Love, and it was by this guy Matt Foote, and he did a lot of writing, so it was more of a literary zine, if you will. But it was like a triple zine on that one. So that was like a great. Finally, was cool to get the recognition from fellow zinesters who I'd admired, and then we became actually like really good friends and did all kinds of other collaborative stuff years later, and I guess still to this day in a way.
Awesome. Can you tell us a story of getting a comic that surprised or inspired you?
I mean, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the community later on, but with the internet and the communication and this Zoom that we're on now, we forget actually how communication had functioned back then. And you're like waiting around to get something in the mail or a letter or whatever it was. And I guess one of the zines that inspired me, it's not necessarily a comic, but it was Obvious Crap. And it was this guy, Guava Jones, who was living in Iowa, I think, at the time, and then later moved on to Michigan. But his wit and style, I guess, was inspiring to me, just like how it made me laugh, to like really get a fanzine, and the humor was so hilarious that it kind of like blew you away. So he was inspiring in terms of the wittiness and the sharpness of the comics. And actually, he came out and visited me in Seattle. So here was a friendship we had only via mail and via zines. And then we actually got to meet at one point. So that was kind of a cool moment. Again, which is maybe strange in this digital era we live in, where it's so easy to like communicate to people, but then to like meet someone that you've only known through these comics you've been sending in the mail was pretty amazing. I guess another artist who was maybe shocking, I guess that's Johnny Ryan, who had this Angry Youth comics, but at that point, I think he was doing more underground stuff. I've never had a chance to meet him personally, but he contributed to a number of later zines, and I thought his stuff is just a gut punch. You know, he has these sort of like non sequiturs and one-liners, kind of like a rated X Far Side. And I thought, wow, he's like pushing the boundary in what you can do. And Spleen Zine also got pretty raunchy at times. And I'm, as I said, going back and reading over some of the issues, it's like, what were we doing? But you know, it was like, I guess it was the time, and it was a great moment to really, a venue to really let a lot of those ideas come onto paper and not just let them be dispersed because you're like hanging out and no one's really doing anything. It was the effort to like, let's capture the moment, let's capture the creativity, let's capture all these ideas and skills, really, like really some great artistic skills by a lot of the collaborators that I was able to like get inspired.
Yeah.
Much better artists than I ever was.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. And you've already mentioned Fact Sheet 5. Can you talk a little bit more on your relationship with it? Maybe how much you read it, or when your work was reviewed by it?
So weirdly, I was more into reading like Maximum Rock and Roll, because I was at the same time was also interested in like punk music and this underground music. And you know, before YouTube and Wikipedia or other streaming services, you just didn't know how to get to music. And once you discovered punk and underground bands, then you became, or I became, or my friends, we became addicted to it. So there's, you know, one or two stores in Tucson, the Toxic Ranch, for example, where we could go and find this music, but we would read a lot of zines that were discussing music, actually. And I guess a lot of fanzines were dedicated to underground music. So Maximum Rock and Roll also had a lot of zine reviews. So that was actually the one that we were reading the most. Of course, Fact Sheet 5 was also, you know, up there. And you'd read the reviews of zines, and you'd order zines, or you try to like track them down in like your other zine store. You were always hoping that your zine would get reviewed in there. I already read you one of the reviews. And then we were writing, mostly I think I was mostly writing the reviews, or some other friends, we would write our own reviews of other zines. So it's kind of like a fun way to, I guess, reflect on what you've read and kind of keep the flow going. But I think probably for many others in this series that you're doing in these interviews and what you're collecting, in Fact Sheet 5 was probably a very core element of it, because without some kind of central hub to keep the thing going, no one would really know what was out there. You would often be stuck with whatever small store you were in. And a lot of the zine scene, I guess nationally and maybe even internationally, was you'd mail it out, and you'd spend so much money. Not only did you have to like print the damn things, and you have to like get the envelopes, and you have to like lick all these stamps, and you'd like be sending them out, and you know, you only had X amount of money, so you were calculating, you know, who do I send to, and you know, you'd send it to the big review ones, and you're like waiting and hoping it'd get published. It was like a lot. It was like a lot of time spent waiting to get your zine reviewed or commented upon. But yeah, those kind of review zines were really, really important at that time.
Yeah. All right. So that'll bring us then onto the community section. Can you tell us a story of how you met your closest friend or peer in comics?
Well, I sort of mentioned it with Twilight zine and Andrew Coltrane, who was pushing one of these like large garbage cans around in at the movie theater. And not only did I try to join his comic and his zine, I'd also tried to be one of the garbage guys one day, because you could switch the positions at the movie theater. But once they were diving into the dumpster, I was like, nah, I'm okay with working at concession. So that was, I would say, the main collaborator. In fact, many of the main contributors in the early on came from this movie theater. So it was Andrew. Then there was also Irvin Stafford, fondly known as Irv the Perv, and he's this amazing artist, and he did a couple of the covers. The third collaborator, Patrick Finch, he was in the manager position. He's also an amazing artist, and today he does designs for slot machines in Las Vegas. So he's still making a living off of his artwork, and we were in the comic class together. And there's several others who worked at the movie theater. So the movie theater really was these grimy McJobs is actually where a lot of the initial spleen zine crew gathered. And I think that was kind of like the sort of like the anger and the frustration and the weirdness of the first zines, because we were working at these crappy jobs, and we were mad at capitalism and dreaming of revolution and tired of being exploited. So that was a lot of like the themes and what we were talking about in early spleen zine. And I'd say that the actual my co-editor of the very first issue, Chris Smith, we had met in biology class in high school, and he's now a professor of biology in Willamette University in Oregon. So he's not really continued with the publishing, but definitely in biology. And we had shared a love for Monty Python. I think that was also one of our driving kind of motives, this sort of ridiculous sense of humor. And we also loved Terry Gilliam's weird cutouts. That also kind of, I think, influenced the aesthetics of spleen zine. But he moved away from like the zine publication, and then I gathered a whole lot of other collaborators in there. And then moving on to at Kinko's, I think that's when the production got better, and we could afford thanks to Kinko's contributions, we could afford to publish more and even more stylish kinds of zines.
Yeah, great. Can you tell us about the first, did you ever attend any shows or cons where people were doing what you did?
I didn't really get involved in that, and it wasn't because I didn't want to. I'm trying to remember back in Tucson whether they even had those. We had a couple shops, and then we would gather, and I would mail things out. And of course, the Comic-Con was a big thing, but that we could never afford to go to that. And it was actually Andrew recently reissued, I think, the first issue of Spleen Zine, and he went to a zine con in Tucson. I think it was earlier this year, or maybe even the end of last year. But at that time, there wasn't any of those. So I really, it was the communication was through the mail.
Yeah, great. All right. Can you tell us when you felt the most connected to the comic community, or least connected, or both?
Well, probably by issue 2 or 3 of Spleen Zine, there was definitely a community. As I said, even my friends were eagerly awaiting the next issue. I had some of the zines at the local shops, so people knew about it, and it was actually kind of fun to, like, know people. And whenever I would see someone drawing or doodling, I would immediately go up to them and say, "Hey, I have a comic. Do you want to contribute to it?" So that's how I would actually increase the number of contributors. Just I would be annoying and go up to them, and usually probably even carried a zine with me. So everywhere I would go, I would meet people, and I would probably say that point, probably like mid 1990s, and then Seattle, of course, was a hub of art and music. I got there in '97, so various publishers were there and underground groups, even though I never really met any of, like, Fantagraphics or anything, but there was enough underground stuff going on that I could share things with them. And when I got to Seattle, actually, in terms of, really, you had asked about style and production, I even had I got an art desk at one point that you could, it was tilted. I had all the ink, and I was doing some more serious artwork, but I was also in grad school at the time, and then started a PhD program, and something had to give. Either I was going to be reading about Balkan history or doodling weird drawings. So that was probably where I began tailing off, when I realized that grad school was requiring more of my attention than just was drawing. So that's when I kind of faded. But it still had the aura, and I still doodle to this day, and I do more painting nowadays.
Mhm. Great. Who were / are your most significant peers in comics?
Well, I think I've mentioned a couple of them. Andrew Coltrane, of course, is probably like the longest standing buddy of mine. Every year I go back to Tucson, though, I meet up with Irvin and Pat, and we do exquisite corpses, and we doodle and we draw all the time. And there's always talk of doing some kind of mailing issue. And a couple of the later spleensies actually had this exquisite corpse element to it. So exquisite corpse is, of course, this game that the surrealists were playing in the 1930s, where you draw the head and then the body and then the legs, and you pass it around, and you can have all kinds of variations on it. And we would do also comics where one person would draw the first panel and then the next panel, and then we pass that around, or we'd pass it around in the mail and then get some back. So, I mean, I think, in terms of success, Johnny Ryan's probably like the most successful people that I've collaborated with. Maybe he would still remember Spleensies. I don't know if he would or not. And in Croatia, it's even Armanini. I mean, she's really very successful. And there was another guy, Igor Hofbauer, and he came to some of my earlier jams, because when I came to Croatia on this Fulbright to do research, I kind of introduced this exquisite corpse, and we'd have some parties. I had this like ridiculous apartment with like antlers, and it was like a very strange, weird apartment. We'd have these nights, these art jams there, and so he's a very successful artist in Croatia, and an illustrator. But again, I don't know if you would know me by the Spleensies fame, perhaps, or not. But yeah, I think that was kind of the scene from the 90s.
Yeah. So how would you say that those peers and these jams that you did affected your own work?
I mean, it was inspiring. I mean, that was the whole point. It was definitely, the art jam was the evening to be spent. Getting some drinks, maybe smoking some puffing on some joints or something, and then having friends over, and then really using that creativity to come up with something, and not have, as I said, not having it go to waste, and definitely being inspired by others. And I think that group dynamic is it's so much fun. And even if you just come up with some ridiculous drawings, even though that was a successful night, and the techniques that people were doing, whether it's with different styles of pens, or the kind of different flourishes someone would do on artwork, moving beyond just the basic pencil drawings that I was doing earlier on. Definitely being inspired. Also the narrative structures and the storylines, and kind of like challenging each other to gross each other out at times. That's definitely an aspect of Spleen Zine and my crew. And again, to this day, even though I've moved on to canvas and acrylics and doing collaging on canvas, I still do art jams with some friends. I have another friend named Ivana Međugorac, and she's a long-term collaborator on collaging, and just seeing her take on a piece of artwork, and then it changes yours, and how you put something together. So definitely, I think group artwork is one of the best aspects of the Spleen Zine, both in comics and other kinds of artwork. I mean, I think it really was some of the best nights spent together in Tucson, in Seattle, but also in Croatia.
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll bring us then to our distribution section. Can you tell us how you traded or sold your comics? You mentioned through the mail.
Yeah, so that was never my strong point, was this business side of it. Whether it was for the zines, or at other times I had art fantasies of like selling paintings. But that's obviously something that is an important part of the art world. Yeah, you can paint or draw something amazing, but if no one sees it, then what was the point? And the distribution was, of course, through the mail. And as we talked about some of these zines that then review other zines. There was a couple of local comic shops or music shops. As I said, Toxic Ranch was really like a legendary place in Tucson, where they had all kinds of underground records and T-shirts, but also zines and magazines of all sorts. Zia Records had zines. There were some other bookstores, and then sometimes you'd hear about a shop or a store elsewhere, and then you'd mail several more of them to there. But it was a lot of trading as well. Sometimes you'd order them, but oftentimes you would trade fanzines through the mail. But yeah, distribution was always, as I said, a little bit of a more difficult thing. And also think about, in those early days, I'll go to like Barnes and Nobles, and they'll like sell my zine, and then they're like, there's no way we're selling this crazy underground maniacal text that you have, this psychedelia. Oh, Left Bank Books in Seattle also had a lot of cool political anarchist books, but also fanzines there. So usually it would be a lot of walking around, spotting a cool shop, going there, asking if you could sell your zines there. So I didn't really have a very good structure to my distribution.
All right. You've kind of answered some of these questions then. Are there any other particular stores or venues that you felt particularly connected to that supported you in your community?
I think there was also, I think it was called Captain Spiffy's, actually, in Tucson, that also supported a lot of the local scene and comics, and had other kinds of art events. But by the time then I moved to Seattle, as I said, it was really just I was focusing more on grad school, and the zines was just on the side. Even though I did work at Kinko's also in Seattle briefly, so I was able to continue the production side for a little bit longer. I mean, again, I'm talking about Andrew all the time, but he seems to have really gotten the distribution side down. His like Swamp Monkey Productions. I don't know if he's calling that now. And he's a master of like reinventing himself. He had Bony Landmarks and Look for Signage, all these great names for his zines. I was always jealous. He's so great at coming up with the names. He had the T-shirts, really catchy style. I guess I should come up with some spleen zine shirts. I should probably actually scan everything in and then reissue them. I mean, when I was preparing and thinking about your invitation for this talk, I really thought there's some potential to resurrect some of the better comics and comments from the spleen zine collection, really have it digitalized.
Yeah.
Produce it again.
Yeah, I'd love to see them. Yeah.
I mean, you could, some of the early ones were really, really crude set up, and then there was like all kinds of like collage that was just like terrible. I think you mentioned earlier about lettering. Obviously, I didn't really have very good lettering at all. It was pretty bad. So, but there's some gems in there. I think that I could probably do a selection of the better comics and stuff, and by the end we were getting some actually like real artists contributing, and there was some much better lettering going on, so things did improve later on. And I'm always proud of the legendary number 11 full color issue that was made possible by Kinko's, for sure. I even had this was one of my homework assignments in the comic shop, or in the comics class at Pima County, and I got to use full color on that one.
Yeah. All right, that's great. All right, so then that'll bring us into our wrap-up section, actually. What do you miss about that time?
I think it was just the actual artistic production. As like you move along, I guess, with your career, your job, or you move, and different things become the thing you do in your spare time. And then for a while, I was playing a lot of ultimate frisbee, and then in Croatia, we actually set up, my roommate and I here, we set up the Croatian ultimate frisbee organization, and that was the thing. And I designed the frisbees and the shirts and the hats, and I was able to work on that. But now, I'm a professor here at the University of Rijeka in Croatia, and I'm spending all my time answering emails and reading students' works and publishing my own work, and then applying for grants and stuff. So it's like a whole different world. And the time spent on the creative part of your brain, where you get to play around with these things, your ideas and the comics, and bring them together, and then publishing that was really, really cool. But I think that the zine experience actually came in very, very handy for my later career, because when I went to Seattle, I was also a managing editor for a journal that the university was publishing there. And I just switched from publishing these weird comics and poems and drawings into then publishing a scholarly journal. So it was a skill set that I think worked quite well. And then I had mentioned the fact that spleen zine was always very collaborative, and I continued on with that for doing projects and bringing together people for research topics that I'm doing now. So I think it might seem silly that you did a weird underground comic or a fanzine, but actually those skills can be transmitted onto other careers. much later. So in a way, I'm still kind of producing zines. They just look like academic papers right now, and co-edited volumes on memory and monuments. And it's also a little bit weird how, you know, things come full circle, because fanzines and these zines and comics were really avant-garde and underground. And then I became a historian, and I was a professor of Southeast European history. And then I got hired in a cultural studies department at the University of Rijeka. And then we're studying like subcultures and graffiti and murals and bands and music. And then the students were producing some kind of student journal, and they actually started producing basically a fanzine. So it was very cool to see my students who had grown up in the digital age actually also producing basically what amounts to a fanzine. They have a little bit more theory and academic elements to their fanzine, but the aesthetic is also very much subversive and very kind of collagey, like what we were doing. So it's kind of cool to like see the kids these days. I'm like, yeah, I was doing that as well. And I get to teach that now as well, even though fanzines are maybe a smaller element of what I teach. But I talk about cultural products, ideology, and politics, especially when teaching about, let's say, the 1920s and 30s with Dada and Surrealism, and the ideas that were going on at the time, to comment on the political situation and aspire to even like revolutionary action, which the Surrealist revolution that they did so. I can talk about these artistic movements, but then also refer to my own work. And even some of my students have even done exquisite corpses. I had 30 students moving papers around and doodling and coming up with very interesting these exquisite corpses and drawings. It's a way to get the generation these days, as I said, which is so digital, back to using pens and engaging in some kind of analog creativity, which I think is lacking at times. And it's great to see. And, you know, at first they're all like, we don't want to draw. But once they get into it, they really, really get to love it. And that ability to tap into your subconscious mind, to put the rational side away, is really inspiring. And that's also what Spleenezine was about. It was about going deep into the subconscious mind and dredging up those things that you didn't really want to talk about when you're at work with the tie and, you know, communicating. But in Spleenezine, we all also had all these like nicknames and obviously different names, so you could publish and people didn't really know who you were. And that allowed a little bit of freedom to kind of do something and say something you wouldn't dare to say maybe when you were at your job or with colleagues. But you know, Spleenezine was a place where these sometimes darker, perverse, edgier, naughtier, but actually more authentic ideas could kind of come out, and kind of laugh at it and chuckle and, you know, feel a little bit naughty that you've been reading this there.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything you don't miss about that time?
I guess being poor, but that has nothing to do with like the zines. You know, I only have like, yeah, fond memories about the zine world. And I mean, I guess the slowness of having to pay for an envelope and stamps and waiting at the post office, you know, and lots of paper cuts. The paper cuts I don't miss, because anybody who has done the analog zine thing, certainly lots of paper cuts, mailing them, licking those stamps to send it all out. I guess I kind of don't miss that aspect. But yeah, I guess another thing that I do miss was the excitement of getting that envelope, and you're like opening it up, and which zine has come, or what has come to it. And in many ways, whether it's through Amazon and things, just, you know, whatever you think of, you like order it, or you can just even look at it digitally. There's no wait. It's like instant gratification. Then we had to wait for things, sometimes months, and you don't even know if it's going to show up. But you know, that was also a downside, I guess, was the waiting for it. It was
Yeah.
both the double-edged sword.
Yeah. All right. Can you tell us one more memory or anecdote?
Well, I was thinking about that question. So this is maybe a little bit more of a serious note, but also talks about the community. And my girlfriend at the time had had some medical issues, and it was endometriosis. And she was having these stomach cramps and didn't really know about it. And it was actually a zine of this other, I can't remember the name of the fanzine. I think I'd come across it maybe in Fact Sheet 5, or it was reviewed somewhere. And she had dedicated a whole zine to her dealing with endometriosis and how she had dealt with it. And I had ordered the zine, and actually gave some great advice to my for my girlfriend. I mean, again, back then you couldn't really just Google something for a medical issue. Of course, later on she went to the doctor and had gotten treatment for it. But it was this moment of like, wow, there is this community, and people can like help you and communicate to through this publications. And that really shows the, you know, the diversity and the depth of the zine world back then. And it wasn't just comics, it wasn't just band reviews, but there were all kinds of things going on. You know, stories, the niche subjects that people were into, really, you know, fandom. It really was a fanzine. People, you could have whatever bizarro thing you were into, and you could do your own zine, and maybe someone would stumble across it and buy it. So I thought that was a very, I guess, powerful and inspiring moment, that whatever you put down in paper and then put out there, someone is going to read it and then be inspired by it, and, you know, maybe you can help someone with whatever you've done with that. And you know, I've already given a bunch of other anecdotes of meeting friends or meeting pen pals from across the country, just through ridiculous things we were like reading in each other's fanzines. And you know, you put something out there, which is often maybe even like a selfish thing or self-centered thing, because you're, oh, I like this art thing, but then later on people get inspired by it. So I guess, you know, a message also as an anecdote, you know, just go out there, be yourself, publish something, and someone out there is going to find it interesting, and, you know, you make those connections. I think that's the great part about it. And here we are, I guess 30 years later. Yeah, this is the 30th anniversary of Spleen Zine, and I'm still making connections. So like, I've met you today on Zoom over fanzines and Spleen Zine. So it's great that they still have that power.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great. Then that'll bring us into our last section, or our last question, which is, can you think of 3 people who we should contact for these archives?
Well, if you can track down Matt Foote, who did Cowboy Love, that would be great, because he was really very also inspirational as the genre of the writing zine, you know, the real, like, the literary zine. And he also introduced me to the first cafe experience. It was Epic Cafe on 4th Ave. I think it's changed owners in the many years since then, but it's Epic Cafe in Tucson, Arizona. I was like just introduced to coffee for the first time too, and like, you know, sitting around drinking coffee, getting inspired. So I don't know if he's out there somewhere. Another one is Guava Jones, real name Robert Sullivan. He did the Obvious Crap fanzine, also very inspirational. And I was Googling him a bit, and he was doing some writing for some other serious magazines and journals, but I don't know if how to get in touch with him. But he was also very, very inspirational. And I guess if you wanted to get international, Ivana Armanini, and I can give you her contact from Komikaze, because I think she's also doing amazing things in Croatia, and taking the zine and the comic book world to the next level.
Yeah.
So those would be the three contacts to get in touch with. Unfortunately, two of them I'm not sure how to get to them. Maybe the resources of your project can track them down.
Yeah. All right. Well, awesome. That'll wrap up our interview. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think that was, I think I said, most of what I wanted to say. I thought it was very cool that you're doing this archive and these oral history interviews. And I'm glad to see that the zine scene is still going on. And I mentioned to you before we started recording, but I was in Montreal at a cool art store, and I picked up a zine there, and it was like traveling in time, because the aesthetic was exactly the same things we were doing in Spleenzy, with the cheesy collage and the weird comics and everything. So, again, I think, 30 years, it's become retro and become cool again. So it's inspired me now to, digitalize the spleen zine, and hopefully you'll be seeing some new spleen zines, or maybe some remixed spleen zines coming out. That's kind of my my bucket list, to kind of get that going again, and maybe get into contact with some of the older zinesters out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, inspire people to go out there, create, glue, get dirty sometimes. I think getting grimy is nice, to move away from the digital tools sometimes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. That'll conclude this episode. Thank you so much to everyone for watching. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.